the battle inside the ADL. My name is Noa Yachot. I am an editor at The Guardian US and a board member of 972 Magazine, which is a news website out of Israel-Palestine and a partner of Jewish Currents. So the impetus for this conversation is a recent piece of deeply reported journalism published by Jewish Currents and written by two of our panelists, titled How the ADL's Israel Advocacy Undermines Its Civil Rights Work by Jacob Hutt and Alex Kane. Relying on interviews with former employees of the Anti-Defamation League, the story describes struggles within the organization as it balances those two elements of its mission. But it's also a story that implicates issues that are a lot bigger than any one organization. Israel's role, for example, as a wedge between American Jewish institutions and progressive activists, state power and civil rights, and some of the most urgent free speech issues facing the US today. And so we'll try to get at some of those issues in our conversation. To discuss, I am thrilled to welcome our panelists, all of whom have a lot of critical insights into these issues. With us, we have Jacob Hutt, a lawyer and writer based in Oakland, California. Alex Kane, a journalist who writes on the politics of Israel-Palestine in the US. He's a contributing writer to Jewish Currents and also writes for The Intercept, 972 Magazine, In These Times, The Nation, and more. And we have Diala Shamas, a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, where she works closely with Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities, as well as social justice movements. Her legal and advocacy work focuses on civil liberties, national security, and international human rights law. So welcome to all of you. Just very basic logistics. I will be asking our panelists questions for the next half hour, 40 minutes or so, after which we'd love to take questions from all of you. So if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can do that at any time. Don't use the chat function. Make sure to ask questions via the Q&A. Okay, let's get right into it. So Jacob, I would love to start with you to set the stage for us a bit. I mentioned in my intro, there are a lot of layers of drama to this story, and at the heart of it all is the internal reality at the ADL. So you and Alex spoke to 8 different former employees who are worried about the direction that the organization is taking, and you described quite a few instances of conflict between its leadership and its civil rights office. Can you tell us a little bit about those tensions and what it is that you think that they expose?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Jewish Currents. Thanks, Noah. And I'm excited to be here with Alex and Diala. Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me most from our reporting about the tensions inside of the ADL and specifically between the Civil Rights Division within the ADL and senior leadership, and occasionally between education staff members within the organization and management, was sort of how, from so many people I spoke to, their own sort of vision of what the ADL was evolved. Many people similar to me actually sort of grew up learning about the ADL as our, in the Jewish community, our sort of best example of being able to fight for ourselves and fight for other people too. And very quickly upon arriving to work at this organization, realizing that not only is the civil rights work, itself compromised by internal conflicts via participation in support for law enforcement, but also just direct conflicts with supporting, or failing to advocate against Israeli human rights abuses, and sort of a disillusionment among a lot of people who came in thinking the ADL was one thing and really sort of finding that their time there ended up being spent by kind of fighting this internal battle to try to safeguard or preserve the, in some cases really commendable civil rights work that, that the ADL does. As a lawyer, I've appreciated reading amicus briefs that they've written to the Supreme Court on an array of issues. They've a strong commitment to LGBTQ rights before the Supreme Court and other circuit courts in the last several years. So they do really, important, great legal advocacy. but just realizing that, thinking about what it must be like to work in an organization and not only have to work on your own docket, work on the things that you want to work on, but also sort of play this sort of battle within the organization and trying to do what you want to do without getting blocked by management.
Great, thank you. That is a great foundation for the discussion. Now, Diala, I'd love to hear about some of those same issues, but from the vantage point of the broader civil rights community, which has had a complicated relationship with the ADL for decades. And so the fundamental tension between its Israel advocacy and its domestic civil rights work, certainly isn't new, and we will talk more about that history. But what is pretty new is a campaign called Drop the ADL, which calls on civil rights groups to literally drop the ADL, to stop working in coalition with the group. And your organization, the Center for Constitutional Rights, is a signatory to that campaign, as are quite a few Jewish groups. Can you talk about what prompted that campaign and why now?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. And also thanks to Jewish Currents for publishing these really great deep dive pieces into such sort of significant institutions. We don't oftentimes have the opportunity to kind of have these internal conversations. So the Drop the ADL campaign that you referenced and that CCR is a signatory to came about in response to a long history, as you mentioned, of ADL's ongoing attacks against social justice and anti-racist and civil rights movements, as well as Arab Muslim organizations, going pretty far back. I mean, back until as early as the 60s. And I'd love to get into some of those instances a little in a bit. But the letter had about 60 organizations originally signed on, and eventually, once it was put out, 100 more organizations signed on. And it's really broad-based kind of coalition of immigrants' rights orgs, Black-led movements, civil rights organizations, Arab, Muslim, South Asian led groups, as well as many Jewish American organizations. And accompanying and the essential ask in the letter is inviting, our sort of beloved community, is the way that it's framed, like our social justice movements, to rethink their relationships with the ADL in light of that long history of very damaging relationships, or very damaging sort of interventions and practices by the ADL to the movements themselves, and not just the issues, right? So it was accompanied by a primer that included many specific examples and very well-researched incidents of the ADL, where the ADL had been counterproductive to civil rights and anti-racist work and anti-racism work, and where the ADL was in essence working at odds with the struggle for civil rights. Case studies of who the ADL has targeted, how they've targeted them, dating back to actually the 30s in some of the earliest instances, where they were involved in surveilling movement organizations, partnering very closely with law enforcement organizations, obtaining records and files, part of that surveillance of these movement organizations, and sharing them with the South African government. In one example, there was a particularly egregious example which was revealed in the 90s, and Alex and Jacob's article gets into this, of the ADL having spied on, I think it was hundreds of civil rights, labor organizations, anti-racism groups, anti-apartheid organizing in the US. And this was revealed, and eventually they were sued, and there was like litigation that the ADL had to settle. And so this is kind of a history that is very well known within some elements of the civil rights community, but because of the ADL's prominent role, there was a sort of in kind of more mainstream civil rights discourse, there was a sense that we really needed to, that the organizers behind this campaign needed to sort of put forward that long history. And in terms of why the CCR signed on, we're a legal and advocacy organization that is in support of anti-racism and social justice movements. And so while there are plenty of organizations out there with whom we might disagree with positions that we hold or advocate for, there aren't that many that are that have actively sought to undermine our work and the work of our movement partners. And so that's kind of why we felt it was important to sign on to the letter in solidarity, and also because many of the issues that the ADL has come out on, whether it's surveillance, law enforcement relations, promoting law enforcement, including celebrating officials and agencies that have done deep damage and harm to communities of color, right? These are issues that we actively work on, and the ADL really comes out on the other side. So our executive director, Vince Warren, said, I think he's quoted in an article saying something along the lines of how the focus of civil rights organizations are usually critiquing state power, right? And not critiquing those who attack state power or who go after state power. And so that's kind of where we see our role and why we signed on to that coalition. And I'd love to get into some of the more specific examples a little bit later on, but I'll stop now.
Thank you, Dale. That's great. And I mean, I think we can get into a little bit more of that history now. Alex, I wonder if you have anything to add. I think it's worth mentioning that just a few days ago, Jewish Currents published a piece by Amaya Gelman, which we can drop in the chat, who wrote, about that history. And I'm going to quote from her piece. She writes, "Those attempts to subvert progressive efforts are not deviations from the group's 1960s civil rights credo, but expressions of their more than century-old mission." So she writes that the ADL's history of working against organizing by communities of color, but also by leftist Jews, is as old as the organization itself, and it's not linked exclusively to its support for Israel. So Alex, I wonder if you have anything to add on that, and in particular, why is that kind of activity so integral? Why has it always been so integral to the ADL's work?
Yeah, well, thanks so much again to Jewish Currents and to all of the wonderful panelists. There's a couple of things to say. Diala mentioned or sort of alluded to some of the awards that the Anti-Defamation League has given out as part of their efforts to cultivate relations with government officials. And of course, the Anti-Defamation League has a lot of access to government officials, members of Congress. I mean, when members of Congress want to get advice on civil rights legislation or Israel advocacy or how to combat the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the Palestinian-led movement to boycott Israel over its human rights abuses, the Anti-Defamation League is always in the room. So they are one of the premier American Jewish establishment organizations with a long history of lobbying and working with very, quite powerful people to undertake their agenda. And so, after, for instance, after the revelations that the New York Police Department, after September 11th, instituted a mass surveillance program targeting Muslims in their places of worship, in their restaurants, in their mosques, the Anti-Defamation League awarded Ray Kelly, who was the architect of that. So I'm just alluding to that to say that this is not ancient history. This happened in the past decade, but there is a long history of the ADL not only just honoring these people, but engaging in surveillance itself and collaborating with law enforcement to do so. So in the 1950s, the Anti-Defamation League collaborated with the FBI and also assisted the House Un-American Affairs Committee, the McCarthyist committee that investigated, suspected communists in the United States. And what Diala also alluded to, of course, was in the early 1990s when there was revelations that an Anti-Defamation League paid agent, his name is Roy Bullock, who his sort of cover story was he was a San Francisco art dealer. There was an FBI raid on the ADL, and it revealed that the ADL had infiltrated hundreds of organizations ranging from anti-apartheid groups to animal rights groups to peace and justice groups, and of course a lot of Arab American and Palestinian American organizations, many of them on the West Coast, of course, advocating against the U.S.-Israel relationship. And so an ADL paid agent quite literally infiltrated these organizations, even going so far to pick through the garbage of these organizations to obtain information, and in some cases, giving that information over to the Israeli government and the South African government. There's questions about whether the Anti-Defamation League itself knew about this furnishing of information with these foreign governments, but the ADL employed agent was doing that. And so, I mean, the story is all of these stories are really wild and not quite well understood by a lot of people that work on these issues today. Like, there's so many people that don't realize that in the 1990s, the Anti-Defamation League quite literally spied on many organizations. So the question is, why do they do this? And it's a really good question. And I'm not going to act like I have the fundamental answer, but I think that it gets to the heart of the story that Jacob and I wrote, which is about how a commitment to Israel and a commitment to Zionism which has long been part of the ADL, has always sort of interfered and in many cases overrode its commitment to civil rights, right? And I don't want to say that the ADL doesn't have a commitment to civil rights. They do. As Jacob said, they have done a lot of work on various issues, ranging from abortion to trans rights to just a whole host of progressive issues, at the same time that they've done these truly regressive right-wing attacks on Palestinian organizers and Muslim American organizers and engage. So, I mean, it all comes back to this dual mission of the organization of being an Israel advocacy organization and a civil rights organization. And oftentimes the Israel advocacy wins out, and that undermines the civil rights of all people. And of course, it provides support to the Israeli government that has never recognized Palestinians' civil rights or equal rights within the land. And so the ADL has been a core part of ensuring that the United States is backing Israel as it continues its system of rule over Palestinians.
Thank you, Alex. I want to go back to some of that work that the ADL has done on behalf of civil rights and against, white supremacy, which I think many defenders of the ADL would point to that work. There is a reason the ADL has found itself historically in coalitions with civil rights groups around some issues. You've all done, I think, a very effective job explaining why that work is in such stark contrast with its activities that have targeted activists. And Jacob, I wonder if you can tell us how you understand the way the organization reconciles those two sides of its mission and why it's always been important for the ADL to position itself as a leader in the fight against racism.
Thanks. I sort of feel like the overall vibe that I got from speaking with people and also reading several of Amaya Gelman's reports about the history of the ADL is that it's sort of assumed this identity of like, let's not rock the boat too much. Let's rock it a little bit, but let's not rock it too much. We're in a pretty precarious place, Jewish Americans. Let's do some work to shore up our credentials as, a bona fide minority group and one that, can align itself with other minority groups. But, as Amaya points out, not going so far in the direction of wanting to really fundamentally critique state power or put its neck out to defend people who are critiquing state power. And that I sort of think that the way you reconcile, or, and that as we heard, the way that folks internally have reconciled, on the one hand, going after, Palestinian activists, Black Power activists, running the gamut on the left, and at the same time, having this extremely robust, albeit flawed in certain well-reported ways, monitoring of white supremacist groups. How do you think about those two things together. And I sort of, essentially it's anti-radicalism, you know, not the word I would use, but this idea that, you know, what we need to do is sort of steer this boat down a very moderate path, maybe a left of center one, in that we want to try to secure basic civil rights for people, but a fear that, you know, tending toward extreme views on either side, this sort of, you know, both sides have their extreme crazy actors, and, you know, that's not the way that we secure justice. I think that that's really part of it. And yeah, and, you know, and I think sort of that's I think the way that they have best understood the way that they can and they should align themselves with these other groups. That, you know, the best way, as Amaya talks about it, sort of assuming this quasi-state role, and that the sort of safest way of securing rights for your people is by getting as close as possible to the structure of the state. And that's a really particular narrow way of approaching how you secure justice for a group of people. And, you know, one that's vulnerable to a lot of critique, I think.
Noah, can I jump in on this?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the why the ADL does this is a really, it is a befuddling question, but I think I hesitate to sort of frame it as a, you know, just a simple difference in theory of how best to achieve results, right? Like, oh, you know, that one needs to be proximate to power, and therefore, you know, we have to make certain sacrifices in order to be able to fight for our people is probably how some people probably, you know, genuinely think of it. And then also the questions when you talk about institutions, of course, is, are we talking about individual employees, or are we talking about the institution? And I know there are plenty of people within the ADL who really, you know, want to be doing the important civil rights work, who came to the organization and the institution to do you know, anti-racism work and civil rights work. But that kind of, it doesn't stop with just like a difference of analysis of how best to achieve those goals, right? That doesn't explain the active efforts that to undermine grassroots movements that are, and coalitions that we see, right? And so some of those examples, and this is where there's maybe a more pessimistic view of what is going on here, and sort of the amount of space that the ADL takes in the civil rights community. You know, the ADL is the household name around civil rights, right? It's the place that you go to understand certainly anti-Semitism, but also increasingly white supremacy in most American households. And it uses that credibility and authority and access to kind of such, you know, this really, you know, this broad public, to elbow out other organizations who may have disagreements with the ADL's approach and analysis. We've heard, you know, and this is most prominently on display vis-a-vis Arab Muslim organizations in the US, you know, post 9/11, but obviously preceding that. You know, I've done a lot of work around the Muslim ban, for example, and the ADL came out against the Muslim ban. It's not hard to sort of talk about the Trump administration's Muslim ban is completely outrageous. And Greenblatt was like, I will be the first one to register as a Muslim. And but at the same time, they were insisting on panels, for example, when they would want to, when bar associations or organizations wanted to host a panel to talk about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, the ADL who would be on the panel would sort of insist on not allowing CARE, which is the preeminent Muslim civil rights organization, to be a co-panelist. They had a policy of not being on a panel or to collaborate publicly with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations is what CARE stands for. And that is a leading Muslim American organization. So sidelining, you know, that the most impacted people by from speaking on the policies that are affecting them is actively undermining, and is something that one can't sort of mash with an analysis of like, oh, we just have a disagreement on approaches here. Similarly, embracing and supporting the expansion and funding of countering violent extremism programs, CVE, is another area that is kind of a stark example of how their work has been actively undermining organizing that's happening in the sort of anti-Islamophobia realm. CVE is something that many Muslim American and other organizations have criticized for essentially being a form of surveillance of Muslim communities, enlisting various government institutions and agencies in the program of surveilling, oftentimes using markers of religiosity as sort of a proxy for potential criminality, and attempting to sort of like root out radicalization, but under these very deeply racist and flawed theories of radicalization. So despite really robust organizing led by Muslim American organizations around CVE, the ADL has come out in support of funding and growing and expanding CVE programming. There are so many other examples that I could provide, but I think that we have to reckon with the sort of undermining work that the ADL has engaged in if we're going to be having these honest conversations about the institution, right? We have to hold accountable, especially such a giant in the space and in the field. And it's not enough to just say, well, we don't know, and there's some contradictions. I think and that's ultimately what brought CCR to sort of step out and join this coalition call, because it has been so damaging.
Thank you, Diala. And we will definitely come back to the sort of real world effects of those kinds of efforts. I want to bring the conversation to the present. Alex, the story focuses on the leadership of Jonathan Greenblatt, who replaced Abe Foxman at the ADL in 2015. And, Foxman was sort of notorious for very aggressively wielding accusations of anti-Semitism. But according to your reporting, he also had a reputation for independence from donors, and it seems like he had at least some respect for constitutional principles. He was very hostile to the anti-boycott movement against Israel, to the anti-boycott laws that were being passed en masse at the time. But he did recognize that they very clearly violated the First Amendment. Whereas you describe Greenblatt as sort of more pliable or aimless when it comes to policies and principle, and which gives donors to the ADL more leverage, according to your piece. So, you reported that he came out against the organization's policy positions on certain issues, which is pretty shocking. If anyone who's worked for a nonprofit knows that, message discipline is usually considered of paramount importance. So I find that really surprising. Can you tell us more about the extent to which you found that donors are setting the agenda at the ADL today?
So I think, I think in our piece, there is a sort of question that we kind of leave out there. If you read between the lines, like, is it the donors that are driving things? Is it, I think with every organization, there's always the question of, the influence of donors versus a sort of institutional memory and history of an organization, and where that has brought the organization, and of course, the policy positions of the particular, CEO, and how all of these things mesh together. And so I think, our piece doesn't purport to answer this question on an overall basis, but I do think that the piece in a couple of aspects points to the influence of donors on pushing the ADL to remain with its strong right-wing on Israel line, right? So the most important example would be in 2016, Anti-Defamation League staffers were on Capitol Hill talking to members of Congress about a new form of legislation that would combat anti-Semitism in the United States. It would come to be known as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. At the beginning of this process, the Anti-Defamation League staffers, particularly within the Civil Rights Division, were telling members of Congress that we have concerns about this bill, that we have concerns that it's going to chill speech that is critical of Israel. This coming at a time when criticism of Israel is rising in progressive spaces, as it has been, I think, over the last decade, as Israel's occupation and apartheid regime has intensified on the ground. The criticism of it in the United States has risen with BDS, the BDS movement, and with new members of Congress that are, taking a step further than the past on criticizing Israel. So, and also in 2016, of course, with this was before Trump got elected, but as Trump was running, there was a lot of fear about the uptick in white supremacist organizing and white supremacist support for Trump. You remember, of course, Trump being pressed on his refusal to denounce David Duke. So all of this is in the atmosphere, and members of Congress are looking at ways to address what they see as a worrying rise in anti-Semitism. And the bill that they sort of landed on basically would adopt this very contested definition that said, an example of anti-Semitism is if a human rights organization solely focuses an investigation on Israel. Which is a strange way to rank anti-Semitism. I mean, if you're a human rights group and you see a human rights abuse you in Israel-Palestine that Israel is conducting, you're of course going to focus your investigation on Israel. So, and so the Anti-Defamation League's position on that eventually changed. Why? Well, according to sources that Jacob and I spoke with, it was because a donor had a different position, and he was getting ready to donate a much larger sum. The donor's name is Mark Rowan, and he had been working on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act for a number of years, along with former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. So I should say that the Rowan himself denies that his donation had anything to do with the position change. But that said, the Anti-Defamation League's position did change. It went from lobbying quietly against it to coming out in full-throated support against it. Full-throated support of it, and today that remains. And so that's one prominent example. And I think combined with conservative donors, institutional memory, sort of key staffers like Kenny Jacobson, a deputy director at the ADL, who has long been at the Anti-Defamation League alongside Aim Foxman and now alongside Jonathan Greenblatt. All of these things have combined to calcify the ADL's position on Israel into one that defends it and deflects criticism from progressives.
Thank you, Alex. And I want to stick with that effort as it pertains to redefining anti-Semitism, and in doing so, targeting advocates for Palestinian human rights. We have seen an escalation in recent years in efforts by Israel supporters to do that kind of work. And I imagine it's no coincidence that that's happening alongside the fact that we have a growing presence in Congress that supports U.S. pressure on Israel, increasing numbers of American Jews and Democrats broadly expressing more sympathy than in the past with Palestinians. Diala, I wonder if you can tell us what you're seeing on the ground, specifically with regards to how accusations of anti-Semitism are affecting the movement for justice in Palestine, and how and whether that's changed in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely changed, and in that it's been it's sort of reaching a fever pitch, and at this point, even the mildest criticism of Israeli human rights record, even in fact saying that you'll abide by your legal requirements or very law-based arguments, are accused of being anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish in all sorts of ways. So just as and I think it's important to know that this push has really been made by the Israeli government to that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which are two Israeli agencies that have led this charge, have reports describing how their policy is to push the IHRA definition, equating criticism of Zionism or criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Everywhere they can. And so that's another sort of warning sign, right? When you see the ADL really embracing something that is a government line, right? Such a human rights abusing government's primary foreign policy goal, I think that should raise many red flags. And we're seeing that push happening on many levels. There's, of course, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which Alex was referring to, and the ADL's position celebrating Kenneth Marcus, who was the Trump administration's appointee to the Department of Education, I believe. Prior to being appointed to the Department of Education, Kenneth Marcus was a sort of single issue, very non-civil rights driven advocate. His single issue was really filing complaints, trying to get the Department of Education, when he was on the outside of it, to open investigations and go after students who were being organizing on their campuses, to criticize various Israeli government policies and Israeli military actions, and using and pushing for a sort of using the anti-Semitism framework to silence that kind of criticism. So that obviously gained a lot of traction under the Trump administration. The ADL should have come out in opposition to it, but instead wholeheartedly embraced it. And it's still something that we're all reeling from. The other way in which, and this is a space in which the ADL has a lot of influence, again, because they are the household name on anti-Semitism and increasingly on white supremacy, is how they're pushing third parties to adopt the IHRA definition. So non-state parties, private organizations, social media companies. And so we've seen a lot of this happen lately. This has been covered a lot with the Facebook push. There are reports that Facebook is considering policy, not fully embracing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, but essentially equating some forms of speech about Zionists and Israelis as anti-Semitic. And the ADL has been sort of an interlocutor in that process, as we understand it. But that certainly has been, if you look at ADL materials, it's really been focusing also on the importance of, under the auspices of combating hate and combating white supremacy, have been lumping together, real concerns about awful anti-Semitism and white supremacist speech on social media platforms that social justice and racial justice movements have been wanting to address and wanting to get social media platforms to take very seriously, conflating that with left criticism of Israeli government policies, and packaging these two things together and saying, we have to sort of just as aggressively go after Palestinian advocacy. Palestinian advocates and their supporters posts online criticizing the scope and extent of Israeli control over their daily lives, with neo-Nazi organizations postings online. So these are the kinds of ways in which we're seeing it come up. Obviously, there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of organizing by groups who are kind of calling this out. But the ADL has not at all been an ally in this work. And not, as I said, on the contrary, it's been sort of wholeheartedly pushing it forward and embracing it, despite, and I just want to note in Jacob and Alex's article, the internal warnings by the legal advisors that, so this is particularly in the context of anti-BDS legislation, which I'm hoping someone else can also address, because that's an important part of the story. But even when faced with legal analysis saying this is clearly against the First Amendment and the ADL should not be supporting these laws, they go ahead and do it nonetheless.
Yeah, I can maybe, if I could add on to that, I think, and I think this is something Diala said near the beginning of this talk, that there's a difference between disagreeing with what another organization does and actively trying to go out and undermine what that organization or activist is doing. And in most cases, and the anti-BDS efforts are one example, the appointment of Kenneth Marcus is another, where an organization sort of has three general choices, and any given event happens. They can support it, they can explicitly support it, explicitly oppose it, or just sort of stay quiet. And eventually, and this is something that we report, there was a recognition by folks in the Civil Rights Division that the best they were going to get was silence from the organization, and occasionally they got it. There hasn't been a filing, like a formal legal filing by the ADL in these anti-BDS cases, but as we report, many instances in which both the national leadership and then affiliate offices, which report to the national office, have come out in support of these anti-BDS efforts, which, as one of the sources we interviewed said, there's consensus inside of the ADL among the lawyers who are doing civil rights law. Every single one of these bills is completely unconstitutional. And for the most part, the legal advocates that have been fighting these anti-BDS bills have been successful, with a few exceptions, but it's been a mostly successful effort so far. Recently, a circuit court struck down in Arkansas anti-BDS law, and although the ruling was relatively narrow, still it's been a pretty resounding success for the folks who are fighting these laws. When the ADL sort of generally is faced with this internal decision, okay, should we just not say anything and stay out of this? Or should we tweet about how it's really great that Cuomo is going to blacklist any organization that wants to boycott Israel? And, then the tweet goes out without, both without consulting the folks who you're supposed to consult with. And I'm speaking here about, as we reported, what Jonathan Greenblatt did multiple times. But also sort of contravening existing internal guidance that was around at the ADL that said, these bills are at the very least questionable in terms of their constitutionality. And the Kenneth Marcus example is another, good one, and to, I think, qualify what Diala said. Before he joined the government, he wasn't a single issue, guy. He sort of opposed the expansion of civil rights in all sorts of different forms. He wrote a sort of lengthy law review article opposing the use of disparate impact theories to expand civil rights, which is sort of like a legalistic way of saying that if there's a systematic or systemic racist result, a court can think about relying on evidence of disproportionate impact on a group of people in order to find that there's been a constitutional violation. And Ken Marcus was sort of broadly opposed to that. Tons of red flags in his confirmation hearing about support for undocumented people's access to education, about Title IX regulations. And the leadership conference, and CCR is a part of this. It's got over 200 civil and human rights organizations in it. And the leadership conference came out against Ken Marcus's nomination. The ADL is also a part of this conference. And, again, rather than just not saying anything, which maybe, would have at least gotten them, some people saying, well, at least they're not, going to totally undermine this prominent coalition of civil and human rights organizations, that directly supported Ken Marcus's appointment. And that was a very clear choice. You have somebody who is sort of doing one thing that they really do support, which is attacking efforts to advocate for Palestine, and then doing a whole bunch of other things that, at least according to their mission, they really don't support. And you have just the cleanest example of choosing the former over the latter in terms of which to prioritize, when you decide whether to support somebody joining the government, and the Trump government, obviously, it should be said. So, I think that's sort of the pattern that stuck out to me most, was so many times faced with just an opportunity to not say anything or to actively go out there and try to undermine these groups. The ADL just chooses the latter.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, it does make you wonder about how Greenblatt or other leaders sort of understand how the ADL will retain its credibility in the long run. I'm gonna just take a couple of questions that we got through the Q&A from our listeners. Diala, I think this one is for you. Can you comment on the ADL recruiting US police for training by Israeli police and military in both the US and Israel? What and how much impact that has had on US policing tactics, and how it ties into the overall ADL ties to US police and the undermining of left activism?
Yeah, thank you. And whoever asked the question should probably also just get on the mic, and sounds like they have a lot of background on this too. I mean, the ADL has been very law enforcement oriented in its approach overall, right? Whether, as Alex mentioned, it was celebrating Ray Kelly, not even before all the stuff came out about the NYPD surveillance program, but in the midst of ongoing litigation challenging the NYPD's program of suspicionless surveillance of Muslims in New York City. Ray Kelly was also the architect of not only that program, but the stop and frisk, the NYPD stop and frisk program, which our organization also challenged, disproportionately targeting Black and Latino youth in New York City. So this was the legacy of Ray Kelly. And so it was a slap in the face to the communities of New York City who were doing years, for a decade, organizing against, these policies, to award someone like him to award someone like him so publicly, right, coming from a so-called civil rights institution. And they never really addressed that criticism, as far as I'm aware. They never really bothered to, engage with people who were saying what's going on here. So I think that says a lot. Similarly, the ADL has, I believe, and I want to encourage people to review the primer that I referenced earlier, that in addition to Alex and Jacob's really wonderful deep dive investigation, the primer just compiles a lot of these different kinds of examples of the ADL's work to undercut important organizing efforts. So the police law enforcement collaboration with Israeli military and police has been a longstanding issue, and local organizers have really seized on it to as an area where they can run local campaigns to say, if we have racist policing here in the US that we're organizing against, why is the ADL and other organizations promoting these trainings to increase police trainings and resources, including why are you sending them to Israel to learn from one of the most human rights violating militaries and racist police forces in the world, as far as that's kind of the way that the organizers will present this. An example that I'm aware of, and I think the primer gets more into it, is how the ADL actively sought to undermine the effort to organize against police exchanges in New Orleans. And it was actually a multiracial, multi-issue coalition to push back against the city's collaboration in kind of human rights violations more broadly. And rather than support, this really great human rights organizing at a local level, the ADL undermined it, from my understanding, because it might ensnare Israel, right? It might ensnare the collaborations with Israeli military and police forces. So I think that's something that is, again, illustrative of how the ADL, in this case, I think it was the local chapter, presumably, undercuts organizing efforts against reducing the strength and the power of police departments, which has been the primary demand of movements, not just, I think people have been really aware of it since the summer with the George Floyd uprisings, but I think for a much longer time. And these are the grassroots efforts that civil rights organizations should be supporting and certainly not undercutting.
Thanks, Diala. We have also a couple of questions about funding to the ADL and whether we know anything about how financial donations to the ADL might overlap with donations to AIPAC, or whether we know about whether pro-Israel advocacy groups or wealthy individuals who support Israel are major donors to the ADL. Alex, would you happen to know more about the biggest funders?
Yeah. Excuse me. I was just pulling up the list that we have in our article, so I get this right. I mean, and I also saw a question about where the ADL gets most of its money. I mean, so as we've been sort of emphasizing, the Anti-Defamation League is, of course, a household name, particularly among American Jews, and it's the organization that a lot of people think of when they talk about, combating anti-Semitism or combating bigotry. And so the Anti-Defamation League's donor base is huge. And it's not just big donors, it's small donors. And it's not just big foundations, it's small family foundations, right? Of course, in the United States, there's hundreds or thousands of family foundations. In the Jewish community, there's many small and big family foundations that give money to the Anti-Defamation League. And so, there's a real, they have a quite large and pretty deep pool of donors, both grassroots donations and also big family foundations and big funders. So, some of the donors that we spotlight in our piece include some of the most prominent Israel advocates in the country, particularly philanthropists like New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft, who of course is also a big supporter of Donald Trump, who's donated close to $150,000 over the past decade. A much larger donor is Seth Klarman, who's a hedge fund manager, and is also he was a major funder of AIPAC, a major funder of the Israel Project when the Israel Project existed before its demise. He's given $1.6 million since 2011. And we also report that Bernard Marcus, who is the founder of Home Depot and is one of the most prolific donors to right-wing Zionist causes, from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies to AIPAC to a whole host of Jewish establishment organizations and pro-Israel groups. He, in addition to his public donations of over 100,000 to the Atlanta ADL chapter, also was an anonymous underwriter of the ADL Center on Extremism, which is the ADL's central hub of monitoring white supremacists and other forms of radical extremist violence. And so those are just some of the examples of the funders of the Anti-Defamation League, that sort of range from sort of centrist, liberal Zionist funders to more overtly right-wing ones. But, it would take days and days and days to read through all of the 990s of these family foundations that donate to the ADL. So there's a real wide array of folks who donate to them.
Thank you, Alex. Jacob, I think I'd love for you to take this one. One of our listeners writes, the ADL has been, as you said, the go-to organization for data on anti-Semitism and white supremacist activity. Can you comment on how they're losing this position by using the definition of anti-Semitism they're now espousing? Seems to me they jeopardize their reputation. Their data is now suspect and unreliable. And I would actually add to that question, we're also seeing like the emergence of Jewish groups in recent years that have been wholeheartedly embraced by the civil rights community, in contrast with the bigger institutions. So how do you see that sort of relevance gap playing out and affecting the American Jewish community and its traditional sort of reverence for the ADL?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that historically, has, I think since the 70s, has been one of the ADL's biggest sort of claims to fame is researching and reporting on extremist groups, specifically on white supremacist groups, and sort of documenting the rise of white supremacy in the United States. And the thing that can make figures like that compelling is being very precise about how you define the thing that you're talking about. And, one of the critiques that's come up of how the ADL generally defines anti-Semitic incidents is, a failure to distinguish between, an uninformed teenager's prank that involves the use of an anti-Semitic slur compared to an act of anti-Semitic violence, and sort of generally in surveying data on how anti-Semitism manifests itself in the United States, a kind of failure to use the right amount of nuance in how you document what anti-Semitism actually looks like in the United States. And so, in that way, I sort of feel like this support for the IHRA definition, and generally a definition which conflates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, is basically just making the same methodological error. I mean, not the same one, but generally just lacking precision. It doesn't feel, I'm not going to spend time, making what I think is the very obvious point that it is possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. And, instead what the ADL has done is supported a definition that, it does not make that explicit. Those words aren't actually used in the definition, but, there are several examples listed within that definition that make criticism of Israel using, language of calling it, a racist endeavor, to that being an example of what an agency can point to and saying, I think there's been an instance of anti-Semitism here because there's been this criticism of Israel in this way using this type of language. And, it really just, in order to have credibility that what we're doing as an organization, that the ADL, that we are documenting real dangerous instances of anti-Semitism, just as what they're trying to do in documenting the rise of white supremacy, is to be very precise about, exactly what it is that we're after. And they kind of give the game away in supporting this IHRA definition, which sweeps in all of this activity that some people may find reprehensible, but is in no way anti-Semitic, just because the person who's supporting it happens to very vocally criticize the state of Israel.
Thank you. Diala, go ahead.
Can I just jump in on a bit on the sort of the white supremacists point too? I mean, what's interesting because I think the country and everybody has been really much more acutely aware of the problem of white supremacist organizing and the very real threat that they pose, even though Black and Brown movements have been yelling and screaming about it for a very long time. And so in that renewed attention, it's interesting it's really heightened sort of how we see different kinds of responses. And so yes, the ADL has been one of the major organizations that's offered research and analysis on white supremacist organizing. There are many others also. Political Research Associates is an excellent sort of movement-focused research organization that also has very deep work around white supremacist groups. And the thing is about white supremacists is that it's one of the major issues that movements have pointed out is the relationship that these organizations have with law enforcement and actually in the halls of power and in the halls of Congress and in the halls of state assemblies and municipalities. Like that is where people, movements are sort of saying we need to be paying attention. We need to hold accountable, right? And this is a voting rights issue. This is a police accountability issue. This is why we're calling to defund the police, because these two institutions are so closely interconnected. And yet, although it's offering this, it's like positioned as an expert around white supremacists organizing, a lot of the proposals that I've seen the ADL put forward around that question have actually been very sort of law enforcement and criminalization centered. and have kind of ignored a lot of the root cause issues that movements have really wanted to focus on. So this is more of a disagreement on strategy maybe, but I think it is also something that is worth raising as a sort of additional layer of critique here, in the way that the ADL has also sort of crowded out the space to talk about what, how we might want to tackle the problem of white violence and white supremacist violence, can be proposed, and how it's sort of been counter what some of the movement demands have been.
Thank you, Diala. And Alex, I'm wondering if you can take this question about the impact of your story. Or maybe this is both for you and Diala. Has the article or the Drop the ADL campaign had any success in forcing other civil rights groups to reevaluate its relationship with the ADL? Do you have any idea what impact the article's publication had inside the ADL itself? So Alex, maybe we can start with you on that impact question, and then Diala, if you have anything to add about the campaign, feel free to jump in.
Unfortunately, I have no idea about the impact of the article inside the Anti-Defamation League. There's been nothing but silence. I will say the ADL, we did, of course, reach out to the ADL for a response to our reporting in many weeks beforehand. And they did give us a response, which was a response that did not address the particulars of our reporting. We sent them, of course, as any fair journalist would do, sent them a list of all of the specific anecdotes and reporting that we gathered, and they just said that there was a lot of distortions and misleading information. When I asked, can you point that out? Because we don't want to get anything wrong, and no journalist is perfect. They're easily, we could have gotten things wrong from sources. They did not answer that. So the ADL has not engaged in a substantive way, privately or publicly. So if anyone is listening from the ADL, feel free to weigh in publicly, privately, email me, whatever. Because no, seriously, like, I'm interested in hearing what the Anti-Defamation League understands about the article and how it conceives of it, and what we got wrong, if we got stuff wrong. Like, I am very, very interested in that, and I want to be humble, because it's like there's tons of things that could be debated and argued and looked at, but we just haven't heard anything. So again, open invitation. But what I will say about the coalition work before Diala has a chance to weigh in is that this wasn't necessarily from the Drop the ADL campaign, but the Anti-Defamation League has undermined its ability to work in coalition with other groups that do some of the same work in other communities. So one of the most prominent examples that we point to is Muslim Advocates, this organization that is one of the sort of central legal Muslim American civil rights organizations in the country. And for many years, they did work with the ADL. They were on letters with the, signed with the Anti-Defamation League, and did coalition work with them. Eventually, the relationship broke down. And Muslim Advocates no longer signs on to coalition letters with the Anti-Defamation League for a variety of reasons. They disagreed with the decision of the Anti-Defamation League to lead or support the congressional campaign to censure Ilhan Omar after she made remarks critical of Israel, the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. And also Muslim Advocates disagrees with its decision to bring American law enforcement to Israel for counterterrorism training, and also its support for countering violent extremism, the framework, the sort of anti-terrorism framework that Diala mentioned, that was really a guise for spying on Muslims that started under the Obama administration. And so that was one core example that we found of an organization essentially breaking off ties with the Anti-Defamation League because of its work around its law enforcement ties and its work on Israel. So I'm highlighting that because it's a core example of that, and Diala may have some stuff to add about the Drop the ADL campaign.
Yeah, so I think it's telling that after the launch of the campaign, there were over, I believe, 100 signatories that added their names. And so I think the messages and the experience that was the experiences highlighted in the primer and the letter really resonated with many grassroots organizations. I know that those who have been most targeted by the ADL, I mentioned CARE, but mostly Arab groups, Muslim American organizations have found some relief in being able to have, to have that kind of expression of solidarity also by many of the other organizations with whom they're in regular coalitions and working with. And so, on the one hand, it's like nothing in the primer was revelatory or new to so many people in the space, but seeing it all put together and having it prompt this kind of conversation amongst social justice organizations, and many of them are saying it's like things everybody sort of knew but hadn't really been said in this way, was, I think, a really important space to open up. My understanding, others may have more of a sense of this, is it's opened a lot of really interesting conversations within Jewish American organizations, again, because the ADL has been such sort of a household name for so long. And, in terms of pushback on the campaign, I don't believe that the ADL has really said anything. I know that the ADL hasn't really engaged on the substance of any of the allegations, just sort of like they've never really come around and addressed the really long, I mean, the ADC, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, was spied on and actively attacked. I wish I had some of these details, but really horrifying details about in that history from a very long time ago, all were made, public, and they had this litigation. And I don't think that the ADL has ever really publicly apologized or sort of expressed any kind of remorse for that kind of work. And so their reaction to this most recent round has been no different. At least that's been my understanding of it. So we haven't seen any engagement on the substance of the details and of the primer. I would say that we've had some of the organizers have had spontaneous outreach from high school students and other organizers, individuals kind of coming together very locally, who have been really concerned by what they learned about, this sort of history, and have wanted to push back against their schools, knee-jerk turning to the ADL when there's, for example, a racial justice incident on their high school campus. And as we noted, the ADL is the go-to for trainings, for anti-racism trainings, and there's been a lot of really great kind of writing, sort of questioning why it's the ADL that gets called in for doing these sort of really important anti-racism trainings on schools. And so high school students have been organizing, and they've been using the primer as a resource, and that's, I think, been really really nice to see. But that's, and then of course we've heard privately that the ADL has really kind of try to sort of peel off some signatories, but this is all, or individual, this is also the question of, is it local chapters or is it something that's happening at the national level? But there's definitely been some concerns around that. So they're aware of it. They haven't been engaging in it. And then that's part of what's troubling, right? This is an effort to sort of have some accountability around some really serious and important issues, and it's not really been addressed in any kind of substantive way.
Thank you, Dia. I think I'll just ask one more question that you can all answer very briefly. This came in from one of our participants. If one wanted to support ADL efforts against radicalism and white supremacy, as well as its civil rights efforts, it seems one needs to support two separate organizations. Do you have recommendations for which organizations to support? And I know that can get dicey because we can forget people, but this is a final opportunity to plug any other groups before we sign off. So Jacob, do you want to start?
Well, Diala can't say CCR because she works there, but I'll say CCR. That would be one. I mean, and I do, assuming that the radicalism as it's used in the question is referring explicitly to right-wing radicalism, then yes, I mean, I think it would be difficult to be supporting the ADL if you really cared about both of the things that question references. But, you know, look at the primer that Drop ADL came out with. There are a lot of really great organizations on there that could use funding. And I actually, the fact that Diala used the phrase household name made me think of the fact that the ADL has sort of for a very long time been this household name, but really since last summer, there have been many of sort of new organizations that it seems to me are sort of entering broadly like American consciousness about the fight for racial justice. A couple of those that I think are becoming much more talked about, much more broadly than they were before 9 months ago. You know, the movement for Black Lives, Mi Gente, showing up for racial justice is a very popular one in white communities. Each of those three organizations has joined the Drop the ADL campaign. You know, so these are organizations that are now gaining a lot of cachet within the sort of broad fight for racial justice in the U.S. and they have made the decision that the ADL, you know, is not a partner in this fight. So take that for what it is.
And I'll be quick. I mean, I'm not going to name any organizations that you should donate to. I mean, there are many. But what I will say is that I agree with the premise of the question that Jacob also raised. You know, like if you think that the ADL does important work combating white supremacy, but you know are kind of turned off by their Zionism, you know, there's no way to sort of like silo off your donation, because of course money is fungible and you know your donation to one part of the group's work will just help free up resources for the other part. And I think the point that I wanted to make about this is like there are so many organizations that don't have to make this choice, that aren't internally contradicted, that aren't faced with these internal debates about whether to support a law that cracks down on criticism of Israel because we're a Zionist organization, or whether to come out for civil liberties because we're also a civil rights organization. Like that is a very unique space that the Anti-Defamation League is in. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like, I mean, for many reasons, the ADL is that way, institutional, donors, you know, political, but, you know, it's a choice that they make. And there's so many organizations that actually are internally consistent. And I think in the year 2021, particularly those who are, you know, watching this and who read the article and are critically engaging with the issues, like, you know, Israel is not, Israel is no longer, I think, perceived as, or should no longer be perceived as this plucky little democracy in a sea of enemies that needs defending from the most established American Jewish organizations. The Anti-Defamation League, of course, still believes that Israel is, you know, an important democratic ally, and you know, have supported Israel's recent moves to normalize with the UAE and Bahrain, et cetera. But you know, at the core of the ADL's commitment to Zionism is a commitment to a state that is ruling over millions of people with no civil rights and no freedom of movement. And so, you know, I'm just, you know, pointing that out, that that's a choice that the ADL has made. And there's so many organizations that are not internally internally riven with tension like the ADL is.
Yeah, 100% agree with everything both Jacob and Alex have said. I think anytime, you know, if you're thinking about where to sort of throw your weight and support, just look for the movements that are led by the most impacted. And if you're talking about white supremacy in America and wanting to combat that, then look to Black-led, women-led organizing efforts. So in addition to the Movement for Black Lives, which has been leading that effort, the Frontline, the Rising Majority, Mi Gente and Detention Watch Network are doing amazing work on the sort of immigrants' rights front, and really rooting it and engaging with the broader sort of racial justice movement calls. in terms of organizations that have been at the front line of pushing back against the sort of redefinition of anti-Semitism and some of the sort of most direct attacks against Palestinian rights movements, I strongly, the work of Palestine Legal is really important, and we partner with them a lot. So look them up. Generally, go through the signatories list of the coalition and check out droptheadl.org for the sort of resources also. In terms of alternative resources on white supremacy, you know, I think that's something that all of these organizations are experts in, right? People who know white supremacist groups the most are the ones who are most impacted by them. But as a research organization, I had also mentioned PRA, Political Research Associates. And in terms of kind of where to throw your organizing weight, because I think that's also how people should be thinking, you know, the local campaigns, particularly like with municipalities and police departments, whether it's to defund the police or whether it's looking at these deadly exchanges is how the campaign has been called, like these police exchanges between US police departments and Israel. There are different campaigns in different cities across the country. So look to some of those for really inspiring work that's being done.
Okay, great. I think that is all the time we have for today. That was an awesome conversation, and I think a great companion to Jacob and Alex's piece, which everybody should read if they haven't already. So with that, thank you so much to all of you. This was extremely illuminating.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. And Alex and Jacob for an amazing article, and definitely seconding Maya Gelman's great piece came out on Monday.
And of course, thank you to Jewish Currents for hosting, and I believe I'm turning it back over to them now.
Yeah, great. Thank you, the four of you, so much. Just as was written in the Q&A, I found that really enlightening and informative. We have more events coming up for everyone who tuned in. Thanks so much. Check out our events in the future, and we'll be sure to send out this link and ways that you can follow our panelists further. So take care, everyone.